Our next speaker is Marc Stecker, the wheelchair kamikaze. I know the origin of the wheelchair kamikaze name, and I'll let Marc decide who learns about that. Marc is one of the first patients that I became involved with, and as usual, Marc is a complicated case. But Marc's a complicated man, very thoughtful, eloquent, a great resource for patients, someone with reason and thoughtfulness. Marc once gave me a gift of a photo essay that he had created from his wheelchair. And I was struck with the beauty and the technical tour de force of his imagery from a wheelchair. It was among the things that touched me greatly about the patients with multiple sclerosis. And as I put together the patient day, I wanted to rejoice in the magnificence of the patients. So naturally I thought of Marc. I asked Marc to put together an essay that included his photographs and talk about CCSVI. So Marc is going to give us an interesting vignette combining his photography and his essayist skills. Marc?
Okay. My name is Marc Stecker. A lot of you know me as the Wheelchair Kamikaze. That's a blog that I write. It encompasses essays that I write about living with MS, as well as photography and video that I take from my wheelchair-mounted camera. I was treated for CCSVI by Dr. Sclafani. I was one of his first batch of patients back in March 2010. I term my procedure a successful failure in that we did discover some kind of atypical blockages that were not able to be addressed, but we know that they're there. My disease is very atypical to begin with. There's some dispute over whether it's MS or not. I have many doctors constantly guessing and consulting with each other, so I've gainfully employed a whole bunch of neurologists and other types. What you might not know about Dr. Sclafani after watching him up here and displaying his medical brilliance is that he is also a very accomplished amateur photographer, as am I. I don't know how accomplished I am, but I'm an amateur photographer. And Dr. Sclafani asked if I would write an essay about a patient's perspective on CCSVI and include some of my photos to try to illustrate some of the points that I was making. It was a bit challenging because none of my photos were taken with CCSVI or MS in mind, but I was able to pick out a few. So we'll see how this works. If it bombs, then I believe there's rocks and garbage under all of your chairs, and you can feel free to pelt me with them. So I guess we can get started. Do I have a clicker, or is this going to happen automatically? No.
You want me to do it for you?
Sure. You want to? All right. Okay. Yeah. If you could, I could probably do it. Does it just? Yeah. Okay. And so here we go. And excuse me, I'm just going to be reading this essay that I wrote to go along with the pictures. So, whoop, we go. Okay. Okay. This photo is of an abandoned structure on the Manhattan side of the Hudson River, known as the 69th Street Transfer Bridge. Built in 1911 during its heyday when Manhattan's riverfront was teeming with industrial activity, the structure was used to transfer rail cars onto barges for trips to freight ships or across the Hudson to rail lines in New Jersey. The structure is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I've long found this derelict structure to be absorbing and have often felt a sort of kinship towards it. Like me, the transfer bridge once stood tall and strong, hardworking, perfectly in sync with the beehive of action that surrounded it. Now wrought immobile by rust and decay, The transfer bridge is a stubborn old beast, still able to grab attention in spite of its diminished state. Like many of my MS brothers and sisters, I too can no longer function as I once did. Instead of rust doing its insidious damage to the hard steel of the bridge, a mysterious disease process now does ongoing injury to the all too soft tissues of my central nervous system, creating neurologic deficits that in 8 short years have left me spending much of my time sitting in this wheelchair. But like the structure, I too refuse to go quietly into the night and hope through words and images to, at the very least, give voice to the stresses, frustrations, and emotions that come part and parcel with progressively debilitating chronic illness. In my fellow patients, I've met countless individuals whose guts, courage, and spirit inspire me, and whose determination to live fulfilling lives in spite of the disease should serve as lessons to us all, sick and healthy alike. Of course, this photo not only depicts the long-abandoned transfer bridge, but also rays of sunlight bursting through a threatening cloud bank, daggers of illumination cutting through a potential source of gloom. These rays of light are akin to Dr. Zamboni's CCSVI hypothesis, giving hope to a patient population searching desperately for answers. Despite the incremental advances made in treating the disease over the last decade or so, MS has remained a maddeningly elusive target, its victims left to choose among an array of drugs which, to varying degrees, all carry with them the risk of serious downside, and none of which offers a cure. The source of hope called CCSVI has burst through this haze of confusion and energized MS patients worldwide, like starved seedlings suddenly exposed to a sunny day. Although still very early in the game, the very promise of CCSVI has beckoned patients to organize and educate themselves, and to ask questions that were in dire need of asking. By shaking up the status quo, CCSVI has already won a tremendous victory, and the hope it has given to many is nothing short of a blessing. But in assessing the full impact of CCSVI, we must also be careful not to be blinded by these same bright rays of hope, as investigations into CCSVI and the methods used to treat it are still in their infancy, and the full impact of the hypothesis has yet to be determined. Certainly, we have seen the CCSVI treatment procedure help many patients, sometimes dramatically, but we have also seen it be less than effective for a substantial number of those who have undergone it. In fervently desiring CCSVI to provide answers for us all, we must guard against hope-eclipsing reason and understand that there is still much to be learned. I photographed this poor soul just a few blocks away from Roosevelt Hospital on Manhattan's west side. Judging by the hospital bracelets on his wrist, he'd obviously been newly discharged. The bracelet warning of his being a fall risk resonates in any number of ways, coming to metaphorical fruition probably within hours of his leaving the hospital. Those of us dealing with MS or any serious incurable illness are far too well acquainted with the notion of risk. From the moment of our diagnosis, we are bombarded by a befuddling array of new and frightening information and faced with making grave choices, all of which entail varying degrees of risk. I vividly remember the day of my diagnosis when, with my head spinning with fear and confusion, I was handed a pile of videotapes and told to go home, watch them, and choose my treatment option, a brand new citizen of a world in which I never wanted to be part, and to which I had no roadmap or experience to draw on. My reaction to being confronted with this new path riddled with pitfalls and landmines was to intensely educate myself as best I could. I quickly learned that every choice confronting the MS patient is fraught with risk. Doing nothing is obviously risky. There's a reason they call MS a progressively disabling disease. It progresses. The existing mainstream treatment options all carry with them risk ranging from relatively minor flu-like symptoms all the way to ghastly and deadly brain infections, and many of these drugs are of questionable efficacy at best. Now CCSVI has entered the picture. What at first seemed like a relatively simple hypothesis with a relatively simple solution has turned out to be more complicated than most expected. Instead of arcane and impossible to understand ideas about autoimmunity, which sound like bullshit because they very likely are bullshit, CCSVI postulates that MS is the result of disrupted blood flow through the central nervous system, a relatively easy idea to wrap your brain around. Likewise, its treatment, the opening of blocked veins through a minimally invasive procedure, also seems relatively simple when compared to traditional MS therapies, all of which ominously tinker with the workings of the infinitely complex human immune system. Unfortunately, things are turning out to be not quite as simple as we first hoped. As research into CCSVI has picked up, we've been confronted with a sea of sometimes contradictory findings. The CCSVI treatment procedure itself is a work in progress, with many treating physicians reporting a surprisingly steep learning curve in mastering the procedure. Please don't misunderstand me. I fully believe there is merit to CCSVI and that its treatment will help a significant portion of the MS population. But once again, in considering when or whether to undergo CCSVI treatment, the MS patient is confronted with the weighing of risk. Not all patients are helped by the treatment, and those that are helped sometimes find the benefits they receive only temporary, requiring them to undergo multiple procedures to maintain their perceived benefits. There's also the cost of the procedure to consider, which can be substantial if not covered by insurance. It's vital that every MS patient considering any new treatment to honestly calculate their own tolerance for risk, and the only way to properly do this is to self-educate with all blinders off. This is a photograph taken in Central Park, a photographer's paradise. The man making the giant bubbles is a fixture in the park, spending countless hours on sunny days creating gigantic bubbles, much to the delight of children and adults alike. Kids invariably flock to him at the sight of his fantastical creations, intent on grabbing hold of that which can never be caught. Sitting shooting photos of the action surrounding the bubble man, I'm always struck by the wonderful innocence of childhood, when all things seem imaginable, even the possibility of catching a giant iridescent bubble. At their apex, floating free, the huge bubbles do indeed for several moments assume an appearance of wobbly permanence, only to inevitably burst in a shower of soapy water a few short moments later. Undeterred, the children try ever harder, taking delight even at their repeated failures at the giddy but impossible task at hand. When healthy, I believe many of us were very much like these children, taking for granted the permanence of the foundations of our existence, which seemed as solid as concrete, but which in reality proved to be as transient as soap bubbles. At the moment of diagnosis, the childish illusion that the arc of our lives would be strong and true came to a sudden, jarring end. The future we had long imagined for ourselves, a precious bubble of dreams, now burst by a torrent of words spoken across the desk of a physician. At some point in the past, none of the patients sitting in this room or the loved ones accompanying them ever imagined that they would be sitting here, confronted with the scourge of disease and desperate to find relief and salvation, seeking to educate themselves and inoculate their spirit with a much-needed injection of hope. The trauma of diagnosis is often followed by creeping disillusionment, as the realization that that shiny miracle machine known as modern medicine, with its myriad high-tech devices and endless stream of headline-worthy breakthroughs, is itself just another soap bubble, the illusory nature of which is only revealed once you are forced inside the belly of the beast. As the writer Gertrude Stein said, when you get there, there is no there there. No surety, no answers, and certainly no cures, at least not for this thing called multiple sclerosis. But through sheer strength of will, we not only survive but thrive in spite of the disease. MS can take many things, our careers, our relationships, our mobility, but it can never ever touch the spirit within unless we give it permission. And that is a permission that should never be granted. We fight back with determination, education, and a big iridescent bubble called hope. CCSVI has for many provided that hope, and in turn for some that hope has been transformed into actual progress against the disease. There are still many obstacles to be hurdled, many chasms to be crossed, but momentum is building. The true nature of CCSVI and its place in the MS puzzle probably lies somewhere between the panacea envisioned by those most optimistic and the fool's errand it has been labeled by its staunchest naysayers. But research into CCSVI has already wrestled the stubborn attention of some experts away from the party line of autoimmunity, and the power of educated patients is changing the patient-doctor dynamic from dictatorship to partnership. Never stop reaching for bubbles, my friends. Some days we will hold one in our arms. This is one of my favorite photos, and was also taken in Central Park, in the section of the park called the Conservatory Gardens. The gardens are truly spectacular, and I'd urge anyone who has the chance to visit them to do so, especially in spring or summer when they are bursting with color. For me, this photo embodies two key elements, freedom and patience. While the element of freedom may be easy to discern, the patience involved in taking the photo is probably harder to detect. When I first discovered this fountain adorned with metallic sparrows, I also saw real-life sparrows utilizing it as a bird bath, just as the sculptor intended. I found the juxtaposition of the sculpted and live birds striking, and hoped to capture a moment that would illustrate the coming together of nature and the handiwork of man's imagination. In order to capture the fleeting moment depicted in this frame, I sat in one spot for about an hour and a half, taking literally hundreds of photos, systematically shooting pictures in rapid fire mode every time a bird took off or landed. Luckily for me, one of those hundreds of photos turned out to be this one. Patience does indeed have its rewards. When it comes to the pace of CCSVI research and treatment, I completely understand how difficult it can be to be patient. Those of us suffering from MS, a chronic, progressively disabling disease, know all too well that the clock is ticking. Any youthful notions of immortality or indestructibility were demolished the moment we were shown MRI images depicting holes in our brains and spinal cords. Stripped of such illusions, a certain desperation can set in, and the desire to do something, anything, to stave off a calamitous future takes hold. This desire can manifest in many forms, from outright panic to steely determination. But every self-empowered MS patient has their radar set to scan the horizon for any new development that might possibly save them. CCSVI certainly holds the promise of being something of a savior. Its radical new approach to looking at MS, offering fundamentally new ideas about how to treat the disease, give the afflicted a life ring to grab onto, a ring plainly inscribed with the word hope. But we are yet in the early stages of our understanding of CCSVI and how best to treat it. The treatment procedure I underwent a little bit over a year ago is far different than the procedures being done today, and procedures being done a year from now will likely be more different still. Therefore, while no one can argue with any patient choosing to pursue treatment now, for some the decision to be patient and wait cannot be viewed as a terrible choice. Sometimes the race does go to the swift, but there are times too that discretion is the better part of valor. As for the other element prominent in this photo, freedom, well, that is what I wish for every MS patient everywhere. Freedom from the fear that we wear as a second skin, freedom from the cognitive deficits that threaten to steal our very essence, freedom from the braces, canes, scooters, and wheelchairs that we use to make up for our damaged bodies, freedom from the grip of a medical establishment that all too often seems more designed to seek profits than cures. Let us all someday soon alight like birds from a fountain, our sweetest dreams come true, our fondest desires realized. Thank you.